In this video, we're going to be comparing the pixel shift or multi-shot features between the Hasselblad H6D 400c versus the Fujifilm GFX 100. Now, in a previous video, when we compared both of these cameras, it was more of a general comparison. We did some studio shots, some shots outside, and we touched upon the pixel shift features. But in this video, we're going to be focusing primarily on that and doing an in-depth, detailed comparison between the two. Now, there are a few things that need to be made clear before we get into this. First thing is, this is a mismatch. This is not a fair comparison. This is mostly done for fun and curiosity. And the reason for that is because the Hasselblad was designed specifically for pixel shift, whereas the Fujifilm, bit of an afterthought. You know, the Fujifilm camera is a more well-rounded system with pixel shift features. The other thing to mention is that both cameras operate slightly differently. The Hasselblad must be connected to desktop version of Focus in order for you to be able to use the pixel shift features. If you go through the menu system on the Hasselblad, there are no multi-shot options in the camera. The multi-shot option only appears when you connect it to Focus via a wired connection. The Fujifilm, however, a bit more flexible. You can select pixel shift from the menu, and wherever you are, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you can use the pixel shift features. It doesn't have to be connected to a computer. However, the files need to be brought into a computer afterwards in order to merge them together. You can also do tethered shooting, which is what I did, just to kind of give it a little bit more stability, but it's not necessary with the Fujifilm. So that's one of the advantages with the Fujifilm, and actually the only advantage with the Fujifilm. The downside with the Fuji is that it uses the electronic shutter, and it's limited to the electronic shutter. You can't use a mechanical shutter, meaning that you can't sync flash effectively with the Fujifilm. You have to use either natural ambient light or continuous lighting sources, which does put it at a major disadvantage compared to the Hasselblad. With the Hasselblad, you can use the leaf shutter and the mechanical leaf shutter, and you can shoot all the way up to 1/2000th of a second with full flash capabilities, so it's far more capable in that regard. The other downside for the Fujifilm is the fact that it requires 16 images to produce a fully completed 400 megapixel image, and as far as I could tell, there isn't another option. You can't reduce the amount of images it takes. It's just 16, and that's what it is. So when you go into pixel shift, it will take 16 images. With Hasselblad, however, you've got the option to either shoot 4 images or 6 images, and in total it only requires 6 images, less than half, in order to complete the pixel shift. And the 4 images that you take, that's if you want non-interpolated colors, if you want per pixel readout color, and if you want 400 megapixel file, you just take 2 extra shots, 6 images in total. So it's far more efficient in terms of the data that it requires to produce that file. Anyway, now that we've covered some of the initial points, we can start looking at the images for this comparison. We're going to jump into Lightroom and look at the images side by side. However, the images were processed correctly in their respective software. So bear in mind, Hasselblad files were captured in Focus, processed in Focus, converted to TIFF, brought into Lightroom. Fujifilm, they were captured with Fujifilm's proprietary software, processed in Capture One, and then brought into Lightroom as TIFF files. So they haven't been processed in Lightroom. We're just using Lightroom to put the images side by side. Anyway, let's jump onto the computer and check out these images. So here we have the images opened up in Lightroom, and you'll see how I've got more than just a couple of images open, and that's because I want to cover several points and not just compare the 2 pixel shift files. So first point I want to make is that although colors are not interpolated in a pixel shift image, the detail and resolution is. So the detail and resolution that takes it up to 400 megapixels is interpolated, and this was confirmed by Hasselblad themselves. And that's the same for both the Fuji and the Hasselblad. It's not the same as shooting with a 400 megapixel resolution sensor, although some could argue that it's technically better in some regards, but just saying it's interpolated data. Now, the first couple of images that we're looking at are actually the same image, they've just been processed slightly differently. So the image on the right, this was corrected with a color checker passport, but only the white balance, not the profile. Everything else is the same. Pro via standard was used. Image on the left, more default settings were used. I shot this in daylight white balance and daylight in Capture One, Pro via standard as well. And you can see how much of a difference, like Fuji really leans into the magentas when you're shooting with the default settings, and it's kind of a struggle in some instances. And I tried a bunch of different color profiles, but they just didn't quite work, because even after I corrected the white balance, like the wood tones went weirdly green, like it just kind of overcompensated the magenta and leaned far too heavily into the green. So color-wise, I think Fujifilm really needs a better profile, and I think when you add a custom ICC, Fuji, the GFX 100 is just incredible, but the current profiles I'm not a fan of, especially in a more commercial setting. If I put the Fuji image next to the Hasselblad image, you'll see exactly what I mean when I'm talking about colors. Like if you look at the wood tones over here, like this is not leaning into the magentas, but it's also not leaning too heavily into the greens. It's a good balance between all of the colors, and it's doing a much better job. Like this is the standard Hasselblad image. It's just doing a far better job in comparison to the Fuji. The Fuji just looks a little bit harsh, and you know, it's just going a bit overboard on the contrast. Zooming in 1:1, we can start to see the differences more clearly in terms of sharpness and detail, and the Fuji does look sharper. However, I've been told that Capture One does add quite a lot of sharpening in post, so this could be down to post-processing as opposed to actual performances from the lenses. In either case, the Hasselblad image doesn't look as sharp. However, the Fuji image still looks really harsh. Like the details just don't look as pleasing in comparison to the Hasselblad. And even if we move over to this section over here, you can see that the Fuji has more depth of field because we're further away from the subject to try and match the frame. But once again, the Fuji looks a bit harsh, whereas the Hasselblad, maybe not as sharp, but looks a little bit more pleasing in some respects. Now we're going to look at the two pixel shift images. We've got the Hasselblad on the left and the Fujifilm on the right. And if we zoom in 1:1, we can start to see just how much better the Hasselblad image is in comparison to the Fuji. And this is with only 6 images. The Fuji required 16 images, and still with all of those files, the results are noticeably worse, or quite a bit worse than the Hasselblad. The Hasselblad just is able to pick out so much more detail. It's able to interpolate far more effectively with that extra information, and the Fuji is just not able to compete in any regard. Like, just look at the wood structure over here. It's night and day in terms of how much better it is. And you know, the sharpening is obviously a little bit toned down on the Fujifilm by default, so Capture One doesn't seem to apply as much sharpening to DNG files that it does to the Fuji RAW file. So when you do the pixel shift with Fuji software, you get a DNG file at the end of it, and Capture One doesn't seem to apply anywhere near as much sharpening, so it doesn't look as harsh, but it does look quite a bit softer in comparison to the Hasselblad. So all of this extra detail and data has been interpolated, and we're only 76% in, so we're not even 1:1. So if we went 1:1, it's a lot better, and we can get so much closer because of that extra resolution. It's such a massive file. The Hasselblad is doing an incredible job at producing these huge pixel shift images. Even when you move over to this section on the right over here with the cutter and the pouch, the leather pouch, in the standard image, you saw that the Fujifilm was sharper, but it looked harsher. However, once you use the multi-shot features on the Hasselblad, you can see that not only does it look better, it doesn't look harsh. It looks like it's real detail. And it's just so much better. It's significantly better than the pixel shift image from the Fuji camera. In fact, the pixel shift features from the Fuji camera are pretty pointless, and in the next comparison I'm going to show you exactly why. So these two images now, the pixel shift image is on the left over here, but on the right over here, this is actually the standard 100 megapixel file that we looked at earlier in this comparison, but just upscaled in post to 407 megapixels. So the software that I used was Gigapixel by Topaz Labs, and you can upscale images using their AI technology, and that will produce better results than the pixel shift features from the Fuji GFX 100. Because if you zoom in 1:1, you'll see how the results from the gigapixel image are actually better than the ones from the pixel shift file. And even if you look at the wood grain over here, like the software, the gigapixel software using its AI technology is doing a far better job than the pixel shift features from the Fuji camera. And once again, both systems are essentially interpolating data, except that the gigapixel image or the gigapixel software is interpolating from a single file, whereas Fujifilm is interpolating from 16 images. That's 3.2 gigabytes. That's a heck of a lot of data. And for all of that data, all of that time that you put into it, you still end up with worse results than just upscaling in post. So honestly, it's really not worth using the pixel shift features. The Hasselblad, it's in a different league, but the Fujifilm, it's really not worth the time, the effort, and the storage cost to use the pixel shift features when you can just upscale the images in post using software like Gigapixel. However, the Hasselblad is still the better option, even with Gigapixel and AI technology on the Fuji image. If you zoom in 1:1,
you'll see how the Hasselblad image still looks better. It has that detail, that clarity, but it doesn't have that harshness. And Hasselblad, its pixel shift files or its pixel shift technology is in a completely different league. It's just unmatched in terms of how well it performs. I mean, yeah, the Fuji image does look better than the original pixel shift file, but it still looks harsh and it doesn't have the same kind of clarity that the Hasselblad does. So the multi-shot features from the Hasselblad H6D 400c, they're in a completely different league. It's just ridiculously good in comparison to anything I've used. And the pixel shift features from the Fuji, pretty pointless because you could just upscale the standard 100 megapixel images in post and get better results.
So there you have it. That's how the pixel shift and multi-shot features compare against one another between Hasselblad and Fujifilm, and honestly it's a no contest. The Hasselblad is in a completely different league. It's far beyond the Fujifilm when it comes to this particular feature. But as I mentioned earlier, this is not a fair comparison. This is not something that can be used as a way to say, oh, Hasselblad is obviously better, because they're designed for different uses. I mean, the pixel shift or multi-shot features in the Hasselblad is its primary function. That's what it's specifically designed for. That's what it's made for, and it puts it in a different category, in a different segment of camera. Whereas the Fujifilm, the pixel shift features were more of like an afterthought. It's just something that it was added in, hasn't been refined properly, because clearly it hasn't been refined properly. It requires far too many images. It's limited to the electronic shutter. It's not something that can compare against the Hasselblad, and that's why the Hasselblad costs so much, because this feature is way too niche. It's for a very select few individuals and organizations for some very particular types of photography, and it's such a small market that it's obviously going to cost a lot of money, because the amount of time and research and development that's gone into this feature is clear, considering how much better it is with just 6 images, whereas the Fujifilm requires 16. So it's far more efficient, far more capable. The results are in a very different league. There's a massive gap in terms of performance, huge gap in terms of results. And honestly, I don't recommend the pixel shift features on the Fujifilm at all. I think it's a bit pointless shooting 16 images for something which is subpar. You're far better off taking one image with the mechanical shutter, processing in Capture One, using a custom ICC profile, and then using software like Gigapixel from Topaz Labs to increase the resolution to 400 megapixels, because you're going to end up with a far better file than you will with the pixel shift. And even the color, it's not brilliant. Like, it's not brilliant in terms of results, especially when you compare it to a camera which is designed specifically for this feature, and where you have a camera system that kind of knows what it's doing when it comes to multi-shot or pixel shift features. So yeah, I mean, the Fujifilm obviously is a great camera. I think it's one of the best medium format camera systems that have ever been produced. However, for this one particular feature, the Hasselblad, it's unbeatable. Right now anyway, it's just too good. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.